Hello and welcome to a video about money, banking, and the financial sector that will serve as our introduction for Unit 4. First up, some things we'll learn about in the coming days. We'll learn about 3 specific functions that money plays, how we measure the U.S. money supply, and why we need so many different ways to measure it. We'll learn about the reasons we're willing to accept these little green pieces of paper as payment, even though they have really no other use for us. The makeup, functions, and responsibilities of the Federal Reserve, which you already know is the institution responsible for doing monetary policy. We'll learn about the U.S. banking system, how banks have assets and liabilities, and how we can look at those on a T-chart. In particular, how banks create money by lending. And then we'll learn a little more about the details of monetary policy. To start with, it's important you understand the 3 functions of money. Money plays a role as a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. And anything that functions in all 3 of those ways can be money. A medium of exchange is a function that money plays when we're using it to buy goods and services, to satisfy our wants and needs right now. Anything that's widely acceptable to people that they're willing to accept as payment for performing services or providing goods is money by the standard of a medium of exchange. Money also serves as a unit of account, which means roughly that it serves as a nice least common denominator to think about. If you imagine calculating GDP by saying we made 72 basketballs and 47 pairs of shoes and 13 cars, it would be very hard to compare the GDP of one year to the GDP of another year where we might have made more cars and fewer basketballs and the same number of shoes, or several of a good that we didn't make in the year before that. We get around this problem by using money as one denominator that we can give a value for all the goods and services we produced in a particular year. It's also a convenient way to talk about how much purchasing power we have in our pockets instead of saying I have 7 chickens and 3 bundles of carrots ready to spend when you go to the mall. That would be a little goofy. Third, money can play a store of value role. That basically is when it's being used to save. It's a convenient way to preserve purchasing power from the present into the future. So if I do work today and I don't want to buy goods and services with what I've earned for several weeks, money is a convenient way to keep that around. Inflation is a threat to money's role as a store of value. When we study the components of the money supply, the first thing it's important for you to understand is that there are several ways of measuring how much money are out there in our economy. The most narrow way of measuring the money supply that you'll need to know about is called M1. So let's start there. This is all the currency that's in circulation, not in bank vaults, but in your pockets and purses, and all the checkable deposits that customers hold. In other words, money that customers hold in their checking accounts. We call those checkable deposits or demand deposits. And if you think of those being the same thing, checkable deposits and demand deposits, that'd be just fine. That's money you can withdraw from a checking account, or you can spend by writing a check, or probably more commonly using your debit card. If we think a little bit broader, then we're talking about M2, and that includes everything in M1, which you can see as the green pie wedge on the screen, but then a few other things that might or might not be money depending on how you're counting. So M2 is all of M1, and some near monies that include mostly money that customers have in their savings accounts, monies that households have deposited in money market deposit accounts, and money market mutual funds that are held by individuals. These are some of the common near monies that are included in M2. And what I mean by near monies is these are things that are not money by the M1 definition, but they still can be used to purchase goods and services. We might just have to transfer them into M1 in order to then spend them. If I have money in my savings account, I can't really spend it directly out of my savings account, but I can withdraw that money in cash and spend it at a store, or I can transfer that money by going into the bank or getting on my bank's website. I can transfer that money into a checking account. Now it's checkable deposits as part of M1, and I can spend it writing a check or using my debit card. The essential thing that you understand here is that M1 is currency in circulation plus checkable deposits, and M2 is M1 plus savings account deposits and a few other things. There are other definitions of money that are even broader, one of which is called MZM, or money zero maturity. The idea here is that we're going to include near monies which are not part of M2, but can be transferred into a spendable form without waiting, and that's the idea of zero maturity. You might wonder, why do we need to have these broader definitions of money, including MZM, or money zero maturity? And the big reason why is because it's important to try to track inflationary pressure, especially if you're the Federal Reserve. Why they want to track inflationary pressure is so that they can project what's going to happen to the price level, and that's part of the job of making sure that they maintain price stability, which is, as we know, one of the core components of their dual mandate. So the Fed wants to track the things that people can use to buy goods and services, because those things can push up prices. If you think about how these monetary aggregates or money supply measurements can be visualized, then here are a couple of visuals that I found online which I thought were kind of handy. On the left you can see sort of a spectrum of counting things all the way from M0, which would be currency in circulation, all the way to the very broadest measurement, which is listed there as M3. And the idea is money that's likely used as a means of exchange is going to show up higher up on this spectrum, and money that's likely used as a store of value will show up lower down. The graphic on the right shows some overlapping ovals, which helps you visualize the idea that all the money that's in M1 is part of M2, and all the money that's in M2 is part of M3, and so forth. Don't stress too much about knowing all the particulars of the near monies that are included in M2 and M3, but know that M2 does include all of M1 plus savings account deposits. Here's one more visual which I thought was kind of nice. It shows it looking a little bit like an archery target, and if you think about all the assets that people might have, on the very outside of the square, but not in any of the circular rings, are physical assets that you might own, or what the diagram shows as real assets. Those include your shoes, your house, which we call real estate, so you think about that as a real asset, or if you've got that perfect little black dress that looks wonderful on you, this would be an example of a real asset. Those are not financial assets because they don't represent a liability to somebody else. If you look at the middle of the target next, you can see a little picture that I found of a giant stack of money which showed up earlier in the PowerPoint. That reminds you that currency that's in circulation is part of M1. And then you can see that everything in M1 is included in M2, along with some non-M1 components of M2, notably savings deposits. And then you could go outward to M3 or MZM. It's funny about M3, the Fed tracked it for a while but decided it didn't give them any useful information that they needed, that they weren't finding out by tracking M2, so they stopped keeping track of it in about 2006. There's a broader measure even yet called L, which is considered to be sort of the broadest measure of liquidity. And then outside of that would be other assets that are definitely not money. And I've put in dark blue or purple there. Bonds go here to help you remember the first important thing about bonds, which are that bonds are not money. Bonds are not money. That's thing one about bonds. What are the other two important things we'll need to know about bonds? Second, you should know what they are. They're pieces of paper that represent debt. And the third important thing to know about bonds is that the price of bonds is inversely related to the interest rate. So one more time, bonds are not money. Bonds are pieces of paper that represent debt, and the price of bonds is inversely related to the interest rate. Anything you'll ever see on the AP exam or any test in here about bonds, you can answer by knowing those three things about bonds. And we'll practice reciting them several times after I get back to school. Well, here we are thinking about all these different monetary aggregates or measurements of the money supply, M1, M2, M3, MZM. Why do they need all these different definitions of money? Why can't the Fed just decide on one definition and stick with it? And understanding the answers to those two questions is more important than memorizing all the specific details of the minor and trivial near monies that are part of M2 or MZM. So the big idea is that banks will always continue to try and invent new financial instruments, ways for people to hold their wealth that allow them to earn interest, but also allow them the benefits of liquidity. In other words, that are easily spendable ways to hold their wealth. When banks invent those ways, the Fed needs to look at the way the banking system is operating and say, has this new invention that the banks have come up with, is it a way that people are holding wealth that will help contribute to inflation? And if so, we need to count how much wealth is held in that form, because it's our job to predict and track inflation, because we need to make sure that we're able to maintain our goal of price stability in the economy at large. Thank you very much.